Hey everybody, how you doing? It's been a while. Glad to be back. I apologize to those of you who tried to watch the last video of this I did and failed miserably at. Forgot that my laptop doesn't record audio for some reason. I don't know why. Probably because it's like almost a decade old. But I'm on a work computer now, so hopefully that works better than the last attempt. Anyway, we are going to be going over the book The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by one Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain. We're going to break it up into sections so we won't necessarily go chapter by chapter. And the four things that I'm going to focus on in this video in terms of analysis are the hero's journey, the idea of poverty, the idea of identity and freedom are the four things I will cover. We'll start with the hero's journey. And the section we're doing in this video are chapters 1 through 7, which I am calling the status quo. So hero's journey, if you've never studied it before or know nothing about it, it's basically broken down into anywhere from 10 to 30 sections, depending on what you want to talk about or what site you go to. The one I prefer to use breaks it down into 12, and it's kind of like a clock. So at the 0 hour or 12 o'clock, whatever you want to call it, is what's called status quo. And status quo is the author establishing the world of the hero before they embark on this journey, before the hero embarks on the journey. So the status quo that Huckleberry Finn lives in. He's a 13-year-old boy, right? He recently came into money at the end of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and Twain goes over, quickly establishes some status quo right at the beginning, with Huck talking directly to us, the reader, setting up, hey, if you know anything about me, it's because you read this book. And if you know nothing about me, that's okay, because the other book was full of stretchers, which is a whole different thing all in itself. The other things about Huck that we need to know are he's currently kind of like an orphan. His father hasn't been around and hasn't appeared for over a year. So he's made a ward of the state, and a woman called the widow decides to take him in and raise him. So his status quo is he's living with this lady named the widow. She is trying to civilize him. Civilize, I put in quotes, by teaching him the Bible, making him wear nice clothes and go to school and have manners and do things like not smoke his pipe, which a 13-year-old boy shouldn't do anyway. And Huck's not really for all that. So his status quo is here he is. He's this 13-year-old boy. He's living with this lady who is trying to civilize him, and he doesn't really see the value of it, and he doesn't want to, right? More about his status quo, and we'll expand on a lot of this when we talk about identity. In the second chapter, when he is with Huck and the other boys setting up the gang, it's pretty clear that Huck is the outsider, that he's not like the other kids, and he realizes that, and the other kids definitely don't go out of their way to make sure that Huck knows that he's not like them. So he's very alone, and he says this in chapter 1 as he's sitting by himself in his room, finally getting to smoke his pipe after everybody goes to sleep. He talks about how lonely he is. So this is his status quo. He is lonely. He's, for all intents and purposes, a orphan living with this lady who is trying to civilize him that he doesn't want really much to do with. He sees her as a nice person, but he doesn't really know who he is. So that would be our status quo. The 1 o'clock is the call to action. And the call to action happens... Where did I write it down? His call to action is the desire to... Why can't I find it all of a sudden? His call to action actually happens a little bit later in this section. It's almost right, it's end of chapter 6. And his call to action is to kind of fast forward and go over a bunch of stuff. Pa comes back, forces Huck to live with him in the cabin, and here Huck is stuck, right? And not only is he literally stuck in this cabin because Pop will disappear for days on end and leave him locked in the cabin, but he's also metaphorically stuck in his status quo, right? On one side he's got the widow trying to civilize him, turn him into a quote unquote good decent person, and then here's Pa, who we'll talk about when we get to poverty, wants Huck to have no affiliation with this world. And Huck is literally stuck and metaphorically stuck between these two places. And it's this point that he receives a call to action to escape and search for his own identity, and he accepts it. And chapter 7 is him getting out of the cabin, uh, faking his own murder, and then escaping on the river. Right. So that is call to action. 2 o'clock is a supernatural aid. As I always tell students, first of all, before we go there, is these things, even though they're set up in an order, it's rare that they will follow that order exactly. It's more of a guideline of here are the steps that will happen, before they go into the other realm, and then here are the things that will happen in that other realm, and then the return up at the top. So 2 o'clock actually is established earlier in the book in chapter 3 when he is talking to Jim. And Jim is his supernatural aid, the person who is going to kind of guide him, give him advice, be his true north to steal from Frozen 2. And he talks to Jim in chapter 5. Is it chapter 5? No, I'm looking at the wrong page. Chapter 4. He goes and he asks Jim his advice on his dad. He's like, because Huck is pretty sure that his dad is back. He's seen signs, kind of around him. So he goes to Jim and asks Jim's advice about Pop. And Jim says all these things about how well he wants to be good, but he can't help being bad. It's like he's got two, voices on his shoulder talking to him, one telling him to do the bad things, one telling him to do the good things. And Jim, at this point at least, and throughout the novel, is if you want to equate him with an archetype from literature, would be a soothsayer, right, or an oracle, essentially, where they will dispense advice, but it's all typically in the form of a riddle. So what Jim says at the end of chapter 4, really, it's not concrete. It's not concrete advice at all. And like the Greeks, like, in Roman mythology as well, Huck has to kind of try to internalize this, interpret it how he wants to guide him on his way. It doesn't tell him exactly what to do. It gives him a choice, or there's some openness within the fate that is being established for him. The most interesting thing Jim says, though, is you want to keep away from the water as much as you can. When that is where a majority of the novel takes place, is them on the river or near the river. So that is 2 o'clock. 3 o'clock then is crossing the threshold. And this is where our hero steps from the known world, right? The normal world, the regular world, whatever you want to call it, their status quo. They step out of it into this new world. And that happens in chapter 7 when he makes his escape. He, sets it all up. He gets out, and now he's on the river and has to fend for himself. So he has taken a step from the world that he knows to a world that he doesn't really know the rules about. It doesn't really know how it works. And that's what 4 o'clock does. 4 o'clock is called Trials. And this is the series of events that a hero must go through, overcome, endure, so that they can learn how to navigate this unknown mystery world. And there's a little bit of that in chapter 7. We'll talk way more about it in the next video. But there are things like he has to navigate the river. At one point, he hears a boat being paddled upstream, and he thinks it's Pa, and it turns up to be Pa, and he has to get past his dad without being seen. Right? There's a ferry on the river coming towards him that he has to avoid being seen because they would pull over or pull him out and be like, hey, what are you doing out here, 13-year-old boy, all by yourself on a river? What's wrong with you? Let's take you home. So that's the hero's journey. We established the first 3, so status quo, call to action, supernatural aid, and crossing the threshold, and we get a little bit into that 4 o'clock there. Let's talk about the big one. Let's talk about identity. As I alluded to earlier, this novel is, at its heart, Huck Finn's search for an identity. He doesn't have much of an identity at the beginning of this novel. And he comes out and says that right in the beginning. Twain has him say, you don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That ain't no matter, right? So he's saying, you don't know anything about me. And in a way, he's saying, I don't know about me either. He's very convoluted in identity throughout this opening section and throughout a lot of the novel until he starts to go through these trials and establish him as a character. So evidence of his convoluted identity. He has all this wealth. He has $6,000 that he got from the end of Tom Sawyer, but he lives poor. He talks about how the judge put him on interest, right? So invested the money in that. He gets about $1 a day, and he's like, I don't know what to spend $1 a day on. What am I going to spend that money on? So he has this wealth, but he prefers to live poor. He doesn't seem to want or desire wealth at all. The civilized thing with the widow, right? He understands that it has value. He understands that it works for some people, but he doesn't really see the value in it for himself. At the same time, he doesn't mind going to school. He hates it at first, but then he gets used to it, and it's kind of okay. But then when Pa comes back, he's then like, oh yeah, school sucks. I'm never going back there, right? So throughout, he doesn't have his own personality. Again, when he is trying to join the gang, join Tom Sawyer's gang, the other boys, Ben Rogers points out that he doesn't have a family, right? Because the theory was that, the best way to threaten a member of the gang from betraying the gang is to say, if you betray the gang, we'll kill your family. Well, that doesn't apply to Huck. He doesn't have a family, right? So all of these things to establish that he doesn't fit in, he doesn't see where he belongs, and the novel is a search for his identity, or at least what the meaning of identity is to us and to him. One more thing about the kids. Towards the end of the gang meeting, there's a passage. So they all made fun of Tommy Barnes and called him a crybaby. This is when Tommy Barnes wakes up and wants to go home and cries for his mom. And he says, so they all made fun of Tommy Barnes and called him a crybaby. They is the interesting operative word there. So Huck is implying that all the other boys made fun of Tommy Barnes, but not him, right? So again, this establishment of himself as outsider, as lacking an identity, is prevalent in the beginning of this novel. Let's talk about poverty. And not just about the economics of poverty, but mostly about the cycle of poverty and the mindset. So Huck prefers to live poor, even though he has all this money. When we talk about the cycle of poverty, it's it's this loop of negativity or negative consequences based on trauma, based on circumstance, based on all these different psychological factors that lead people to live in this cycle of poverty no matter how much money they or wealth they occur. Um, and one of those things is only living in the present. There's the past holds no meaning because, that's the past. Who cares, right? It has nothing to do with me right now. But there's also no future planning as well because I'm only thinking about right now, right? Having no money, not having food today, not having a place to stay, whatever the trauma that triggers this cycle of poverty, leads people in this cycle, in this mindset, to live only in the present. And Huck says that at one point. The widow is teaching him about Moses and what a great leader he was. And Huck is like, hey, yeah, this Moses guy, he sounds great, right? He sounds like my kind of dude. But then the widow says he's been dead for a while. And then he says, well, I don't take stock in dead people, right? So Moses, living in the past, has nothing to do with him right now in Huck's mind because that was in the past. Who cares to him, right? All that matters is right now. If Moses was alive in 1840 when this novel is set, bam, Huck may have had a totally different novel, right? He may have stayed with the widow, become a Christian, lived a quote unquote civilized life, and, it's a different and much more boring novel. But he doesn't. He doesn't take stock in dead people, right? He also, there is a severe dislike of polite society, right? And it's an attitude. It's a belief that, well, you're not better than me, even though you have more than me or you act, in a certain way. So there's a rejection of polite society. And Huck says this as well because he talks about they, meaning the widow and I forget the other lady. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. You don't know me, right? That's what Huck is saying. You don't know me. You don't get to judge me, right? Which is a very cycle of poverty mindset. The big thing is Pa. Pa is the character that really exemplifies the cycle of poverty the most. Pa hates polite society, hates people who, have jobs, go to church, go to school, right? Have, stereotypical normalcy in their lives. And what's sad is that oftentimes adults who are in a cycle of poverty, either knowingly or subconsciously want their children in that cycle as well because they don't want their children to be better than them, right? It points to their failures, quote unquote, as people, as parents, as human beings, right? If you have a child who is more successful than you, is more able to navigate a polite world, that reflects poorly on you. Now, for those who don't live in a cycle of poverty, this is actually the opposite. You want your children to have more than you. You want them to succeed more than you because that's what should happen, right? Each new generation is an opportunity to improve. But people in the cycle of poverty don't understand that. And Pa just bores into Huck when he shows up in Huck's room. I think that's in chapter 5. Yeah, chapter 5. Pa says, I'll take you down a peg before I get done with you. You think you're better than your father now? Right? He talks about Huck's highfalutin foolishness, right? Huck has an opportunity to better his life, and Pa should be a, a, a parent who is not deep in the cycle of poverty, be like, no, you should stay here and you should go to school and you should have all the things that I cannot provide for you because I recognize that I can't do this for you. And you are in a better place. And I just hope you don't forget me and you have some pity on me. But he doesn't. He's mad at Huck for being there, right? Huck, there's a picture that Huck got for being a good student, and in a symbolic gesture, Pa rips it up in front of him, right? So this is the cycle of poverty, and it'll be interesting to see when and how that manifests itself throughout the rest of the novel. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about is freedom. And it's pretty clear Huck doesn't have any freedom. He is, like we said before, both literally and metaphorically stuck, right, between these two worlds. In terms of the literal, he's stuck in Pa's house, right? And so this lack of freedom is what leads to the call of action, right? It also has to do with identity and his loneliness. But at one point, Huck says, all I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. He recognizes that the freedom he has right now, that his lack of freedom is not going to work for him. And so he needs a change, and he doesn't care what it looks like. He just needs freedom. Which we could go into, the American dream and Americana and traditions in American literature about how this is a theme that constantly shows up in American literature, right? That not being tied down, nobody telling me what to do attitude that, brought the pilgrims here and led the pioneers across the country and, sparked the Revolutionary War and to an extent launched the Civil War. So it's this desire for freedom that leads to the quest. Huck is lonely, he is trapped, and he needs to leave in order to go through this journey of self-discovery, his search for identity, right? Okay. So that's part 1 of the book, chapters 1 through 7. Next video will be chapters 8 through 14, which I'm calling Trials. I bet you can guess what we're going to focus on in there. Have a good day. It was good to see you again. Those of you who I have never taught before and have subscribed, hi, welcome. Thank you for subscribing. I've been asked in comments if I'm going to ever do more about Between the World and Me or any of the other books that I did partial chapters out of. And maybe, we'll see. Possibly. I wouldn't count on it, but possibly. Anyway, have a good day. Thank you so much, everybody.